Well, that should get us in the Christmas spirit, huh? To me, Christmas is not Christmas and is not complete until I've heard The Little Drummer Boy and O Holy Night. So we're halfway there. But later today we'll hear O Holy Night, right? So it's going to be good. It's going to be great. So in all of that great and good and upbeat stuff, I'm going to be a little bit of a Debbie Downer today, and we're going to talk about being in a crisis, in crisis mode. So the topic is when right doesn't seem to work. So we're going to go from this beautiful high that we're on, and we're going to have to drop down a bit, and then we'll hopefully bring you back up again before it's over and before we leave. So we'll get there. So there's a thing called a terse verse. I have no idea what that actually means, but I found it somewhere, and here's one that you may have seen somewhere in your life. From the day of your birth till you ride in the hearse, things are never so bad that they couldn't get worse. I don't know, I've heard that off and on throughout my life. It just reminds us that life sometimes deals us things that we would rather not be dealt with and we would not have to deal with. But on the other hand, sometimes we think things couldn't get much worse, and they just do get worse. And they go from not so good to even worse to perhaps even horrible. Sometimes it's because of communication issues. I want to read this one little thing. This was in Dear Abby. Actually, Chuck Swindoll put it in one of his books, and it was, so I don't know how long ago this was and when Dear Abby did this, but she told the story of a fellow by the name of R.D. Jones. And R.D. Jones put an ad in the classified section of the newspaper. Things kind of went from bad to worse, and I think you'll catch that as we read his ads as they went from day by day. So on Monday, he put this ad in the classified, for sale. R.D. Jones has one sewing machine for sale. Phone 948-0707 after 7 p.m. and ask for Mrs. Kelly, who lives with him cheap. You didn't get that. She lives with him cheap. Okay, so this is going to go really well. I think this is a sermon that's going from bad to worse. Okay. Tuesday, the notice says, we regret having aired in R.D. Jones's ad yesterday. It should have read, one sewing machine for sale, period, cheap, period. Phone 948-0707 and ask for Mrs. Kelly, who lives with him after 7 p.m. On Wednesday, notice, R.D. Jones has informed us that he has received several annoying phone calls because of the error made in his classified ad yesterday. His ad stands corrected as follows. For sale. R.D. Jones has one sewing machine for sale, period. Cheap, period. Phone 948-0707 after phone 7 p.m. and ask for Mrs. Kelly, who lives with him. Not getting any better. Thursday, notice, says this. I, R.D. Jones, have no sewing machine for sale. I smashed it. Don't call 948-0707 as the telephone has been disconnected. I have not been carrying on with Mrs. Kelly. Until yesterday, she was my housekeeper, but she quit. So, maybe that was better 10 years ago than today. But sometimes things just kind of go bad. I want us to look at the story of Christmas, because I think in that story, if you want to turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 2, that would be a good thing to do, kind of be finding your way there. If we look at the whole story of Christmas, and if we zero in on Joseph, it seems to me that one of the ways to look at this is the fact that Joseph kind of went from one crisis to another. And they just sort of kept adding up, and he never completely got over one before another one was on him. At least that's kind of the way the text looks. So if you look at the dilemma that Joseph faced, his first crisis we talked about last week, his first crisis was Mary's pregnancy. That was not only a social crisis, a religious crisis, a personal crisis. It was kind of a crisis on every level that you can imagine. So the first crisis, there should be a screen, I think, on that. So the first crisis is simply Mary's pregnant. What do we do? How do we handle this? And you remember on that particular one, Joseph came along and was trying to figure out what to do, and the angel came and gave him some advice, and he took the advice and followed the advice, and that seems to have settled down into that regard a little bit. Then it wasn't too long after that, and if we know the story in Luke and combine the story of Luke and Matthew, we know that probably the next crisis in his life was we have to get to Bethlehem. All of a sudden there's this law that comes out that says you've got to go back to your own country, go back to your own city, and we got to get to Bethlehem. We have to pay the taxes, we have to figure out all of this stuff. And on top of that, he has a pregnant wife who he now has to take with him to Bethlehem. At least I assume that in those days the whole family had to go, that he couldn't have just gone on his own. But that would have created another crisis if he'd gone on his own and left Joseph and left Mary behind. So he was kind of between a rock and a hard place, and he chose to take Mary with him. And so off they go to Bethlehem. Not a huge distance on the map. If you look on the map, it's only about this far on a good Bible map. It's not a big deal. You and I drive more than that every time I come over from Santa Barbara. It's no big deal, an hour and a half. But in that day, the only mode of transportation, the only modes of transportation were walking or riding on some kind of another animal, like a donkey or a horse, maybe a camel. And those were not known to go incredibly fast. And I have 3 children, so I've had a pregnant wife at least 3 times. Well, not at least 3 times. Well, actually, we did have a couple of miscarriages, so maybe more. But so I know what that's like. And so traveling even 70 miles can be a challenge at certain issues and certain times in the pregnancy. We won't go into details on that. But we've got a very pregnant wife, and now we need to travel about maybe 70 miles or so to get from Nazareth, where they lived, to Bethlehem. And I don't imagine that it was a very comfortable journey. It wouldn't have been a very comfortable journey if you'd been perfectly healthy. But to be 8 months pregnant or however far along she was, and to have to travel that many days, which probably took a good week or so or more of traveling, I'm not really sure. I don't know. I never have really done donkey time, so I don't really know how long that would really take. But it was a slow process, and it seems like, at least according to all the pictures we see that have been developed, it appears to us that Joseph walked and Mary rode. So how far can you walk in a day or two, in a day or 3, and especially with someone who's with child? So that was the next crisis, getting her to Bethlehem. And then they get to Bethlehem, and we run into the third crisis, don't we? There's no room. I've got a wife that is pregnant. We have been told by angels that she is carrying in her body the Son of God. Shouldn't God have kind of created a pathway, maybe the presidential suite in some inn for them to be in? But of course they were poor. They didn't have a lot of money. They had no room. The inns were full because everybody was coming to Bethlehem to be registered and to take care of that. And so everyone is trying to deal with all of that, and there's no room. And so eventually someone took pity on them, and they end up in what was probably a cave, what was known as the mangers, where the animals slept, and that is where they're going to stay. Which I think leads to the fourth crisis that we sometimes forget about. And this is totally a message given by a guy, okay? So women, remember that as I say the next thing. It's like, you're going to give birth now? As if there is some choice in this matter. And because, as guys, we think that way. Our first son was born on, thankfully, the morning right after the Super Bowl. But things were a little tense during the Super Bowl. And it was kind of like, now? Water broke now? You got to be kidding. So there's that crisis of, we're going to have the baby now. We're in a manger. There's animals all around us. I don't know if they had any idea of sanitary things or not, but it had to be, you have to put yourself, or at least for a moment, in Joseph's spot, thinking, God, this is your son? And you're letting this happen? You're letting this go this way now? I don't get this. It develops somewhat of, I would think, a bit of a crisis. We always get the impression, and maybe it was and maybe it wasn't, we always get the impression that Mary was a lot calmer through all of this. I don't know if that's true or not, but you just sort of get the impression she just kind of went with the flow, and it kind of happened. You get I don't know if that's true or not, but I like to think of it that way. And then after the next crisis comes along, it's like, now where do we live? The crisis is over a little bit. People are leaving Bethlehem, going back to their own places. But I've got a brand new baby that is probably not travel worthy, and we're not going to get back on the donkey and travel back. So now what do we do? Where do we stay? How are we going to find a place to live? And so he's got to find a place to live in Bethlehem. And we know that basically they lived there a while, and they were in some place different probably than the stable, because the whole story of the wise men gives us kind of a clue that came later, came a little bit later than just the immediate. I know they're always in the nativity scene, the wise guys are always there, but the story really gives us that they came later in the picture, not right then. And so you've got to find a place to live. And if you're going to find a place to live, you have to find a way to pay for it. And you have to find a way to make a living and do all of those things. And how long are we going to stay here? And is an angel going to pop in and tell us what to do next? Was the angel going to be our GPS system? Or how are we going to get from here to there, and what's that going to look like? And so they find a place to live, apparently. And then we run into the last, well, maybe not the last, but the next crisis, which we jump into in Matthew chapter 2, and that is Herod. The next crisis, and probably the biggest one he faces, that is the most life-threatening, is this one. And maybe all of the others were precursors to prepare for this moment. So if you have your Bibles, let's look at Matthew chapter 2. And I want to read several verses. I want to read the first 12 verses or so, and then we'll jump down and pick up again in verse 19. So a rather lengthy section, but listen as we read the word of the Lord. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ child was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what the time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. And then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, we will pick up 13 here. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." And he rose and took the child and his mother by night, and they departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." And then in verse 19, "But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. And then it tells that he went on to Nazareth. Pretty significant crisis. Herod is going to be a threat. We believe, probably it's true, that the wise men came. We don't know a whole lot about them, and that's not the point of the message anyway, but we don't know a great deal about them. But I'm convinced that at least one of the reasons the Lord brought them into their life was to provide them the financial security to live in Egypt. Because now all of a sudden they had gold and frankincense and myrrh. And we get the impression that Jesus was raised in Nazareth without a great deal of income, lived not in poverty, but certainly not in wealth. And so they must have needed that money that came from those things to provide for them for their journeys into Egypt, live in Egypt, and then get back to Nazareth. And so it was a good thing for them. But in all honesty, Herod was not a nice guy, and I think Joseph knew that, and so we've got to somehow get this child to safety, and they do. And so those are kind of the crises that Joseph has to deal with, and every once in a while in those crises, angels jump into the story and give him the version of what he should do. But I think we need to remember that I'm guessing a little bit here, maybe adding a little bit in here, but I don't think too much. I think it's safe to say that the angels came because probably Joseph was wrestling with what to do. How do we handle this? What do I do now? I've got the Son of God here. I've got his mother, earthly mother. I'm the stepfather or the adopted father or whatever. What do I do? How do I handle this? Where do we go? Where do we go next? What do we do next? Where is this supposed to take place? And in that wrestling, the angel comes and gives him the answer. Most of us, when we go through crisis, don't get angels. And every now and then, we get someone who is maybe angelic that comes in and helps us, and we get some advice that we're not sure where it came from. But generally, we don't get that. We're left to kind of anticipate and figure out what to do. So this morning, what I want to do is jump off from this, and just from the years of my life and from kind of the whole tone of Scripture. It'll be difficult to jump in and give proof texts as we go along, but to just kind of give us a perspective on how to handle the crisis. What are the things that we need to do? Somehow in the work that God has called us to in these last few years, we seem to get into churches that have crises or close to it. And so we've had to do some fairly significant research on this to find out, what do we do in a crisis? How do we do that? So another couple of verses that will be important for us will be in chapter 1 of James. But the first thing that I want to do is already up there, and that we need to maintain a proper perspective. If you look at Joseph, somehow in the midst of all that was going on, he somehow managed to keep his head above water. He seemed to keep his head when everybody else around him maybe wasn't. We don't know. We don't know how his family handled this pregnancy. We don't know how his friends did. We're not given any of that information. But we somehow assume that there was a righteousness to Joseph and a depth to Joseph that enabled him to somehow keep the right perspective as he went through these things and continued apparently to seek the Lord in the process. You remember what James chapter 1 reminds us of. Count it all joy, brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness and endurance. Consider it joy when you encounter various trials. He doesn't say if you encounter various trials, because I think it's assumed in life that we will encounter trials. We will encounter difficult days. And so if that is true, the proper perspective in a crisis in life is important. Attitude is the key. Maintaining a proper attitude. Understanding that we will all face a crisis. If you're not in one right now, I just want to give you some encouragement. Tomorrow's a new day. You may get one tomorrow. It will come. It is somewhere, I don't know where we pick this up, but somehow there is, occasionally I run into this attitude in the Christian life that if I come to know Jesus, all of these things are gone. I will no longer have any trials. And I don't know, apparently, I don't know where people get that idea, because it doesn't match with life at all. It doesn't match with Scripture at all. It doesn't match with anything I know at all. We run into them and we seem to find them whether we're looking or not. And so, joy and seeking to understand the purpose of the crisis becomes important. The perspective on the crisis. Why? It's kind of like, why is this happening? Lord, how can I gain understanding in this? What is it you want me to learn? What is it I need to know? All of those kinds of things help us maintain a proper perspective as we go through a crisis. And a crisis could be a big one, a little one. It can be all over the map. And so it could be an illness. It could be grief. It could be financial. It could be career. It could be church. It could be family. It could be anything. It can go on and on. The second thing that I think is important in the midst of a crisis, in order to somehow remain calm, is to take responsibility for the crisis. It's amazing how many people I run into who simply will not take responsibility for the crisis, for what's happening. Now, you may be in a crisis that's 99% somebody else's fault. But there's always the question, there's always that little part of me that wants to say, but what part of this might be mine? What part of this might I be responsible for? So what do I need to take responsibility for? I don't need to take responsibility for what everybody else has screwed up, but I do need to take responsibility for what I may have contributed to the whole thing. And that is not easy. It's not usually pleasant or necessarily enjoyable, but if you're going to get through it, it's absolutely essential. You aren't going to get through it if you don't. One author gave these three options for any crisis, and I think this is on the screen. Here are three choices when you run in terms of taking responsibility for a crisis. You can refuse to accept that this crisis is even existing or that it's a problem, and you're going to fail. You won't get through it that way. It just won't happen. You have to accept some responsibility. You can accept it, but just kind of put up with it. Just kind of go, well, that old term, well, this is just kind of my cross to bear. And just kind of live the rest of your life that way. And you can accept it and you'll survive, but you certainly won't thrive. And you certainly won't get through it. You just kind of, well, okay. Or you can accept it and try to benefit from it. Try to learn from it. What can I learn? How can I grow? What is God trying to teach me? Why have I been put through this ringer? Why have I been put through this whole thing? Why am I having this illness? Or how did this, how can I grow? That's accepting responsibility for it. If you look at the story of Joseph, or remember last week we looked at Daniel, we looked at a couple others whom I've forgotten right now, but we've looked at some others, I think David, others that went through crises, they accepted responsibility. When I accept responsibility for the crisis, at least for what is my portion of it, or at least begin to own it, you get an illness, you go to the doctor and you find out that you've got an illness that's maybe life-threatening. You weren't necessarily responsible for that, but you still have to kind of own the whole thing and say, well, if I'm going to get through this, I'm going to have to take responsibility for my treatment, for how I'm going to handle that, for what I'm going to do, for what I'm going to get through it. How can I grow through this? What's God trying to teach me? All of those things become part of the process. If you simply refuse to accept it and go, I'm not going to do anything about it, this just isn't happening, it isn't going to change anything. It's still going to happen. Joseph continued to accept responsibility. He got his family where they needed to be. He took responsibility to make that all happen. Scott Peck, in a book called The Road Less Traveled, made this quote. Let me read it for you. This is a great truth, one of the greatest truths. It is a great truth because once we truly see this truth, we transcend it. Once we really know that life is difficult, once we truly understand and accept that, then life is no longer difficult. It still kind of is, but because once it has been accepted, the fact that life is difficult no longer matters. It's just becomes a part of life. Most of us do not fully see this truth that life is difficult. Instead, we moan or more or less complain incessantly and loudly about the enormity of our problems as if life were generally easy. As if it should be easy. And the reality is just the opposite. There's nothing in life that ever said it should be easy. I'm not sure where we got that concept. That life should be easy. We should be able to just sail through this thing. Nothing in life matches that reality. Many of you are old enough, as I am, to remember Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey once said, in times like these, it is good to remember that there have always been times like these. And that's pretty wise as well. The next thing that I would say is that in this process of trying to deal with a crisis is to not lose sight of the big picture. There's a big picture out there that's bigger than us, that's bigger than the crisis, that's bigger than the problem we're going through. It's a lot bigger than anything that we're looking at or going through. Joseph, going back and forth to Egypt, doing all those things, there was a lot more going on in all of that than just one little guy taking his family down to Egypt and back again. There was all kinds of things going on, politically and religiously, and all kinds of things that God was beginning to move things around to get ready for the introduction years later of Jesus the Messiah. And he was getting all of those dominoes ready to go and ready in place. So there were many things that were taking place that Joseph probably had no idea of, and probably never would have any idea of this side of heaven. And so when God closes doors, You ever really wanted to do something and God just shut the door? Frustrating. Generally, I have found that when God closes those doors, eventually, when I learned kind of went on behind those doors, I'm glad they weren't open. I'm glad He didn't open every door that I wanted Him to open. I'm glad He hasn't answered every prayer. Or as I've told some people, some of you wouldn't be here. But God doesn't answer all of our prayers, thankfully. And sometimes when He closes those doors, He opens other doors. Our first pastorate was in Iowa. And after we'd been in Iowa for a while, we decided that wasn't really where we wanted to be. And many people in the church agreed with that. But they didn't really want us so badly either. But we kept trying to find other churches in the Midwest region. Our families were from Minnesota, and we at that time loved Minnesota because we didn't know how beautiful California could be. And so we loved snow still and some things like that. And so we kept looking for churches, and God would open doors for us to explore, and then the door would be shut, and they would shut. And I have a whole file. I think I finally got rid of it, but I had a whole file of churches that we started to look at, and then the door closed. And we could never understand why God did that, because we wanted to stay in that area. And then a door opened for us in Southern California, and we kind of pushed that door to see if that would open, and that was wide open, and we came to California. That was over 30 years ago, and we've never left, and been incredibly grateful that God opened that door and closed the others. But it was frustrating at the time. It seemed like kind of a crisis that we couldn't quite get through. But God knew what He was doing, and we had to somehow accept the fact that in the big picture of things, God had a bigger plan and had a different plan for us than we had for ourselves. We lose sight of the big picture in a number of ways. A lot of times we lose sight of the picture because we simply lack the experience to know that there is a big picture. This is one of those places where age and time helps a great deal. As we somehow get a little bit older and we can look back, we can begin to see things a lot better of how God did things than we can when we're looking forward. Make sense? And so that's one of those, I'm not sure when I was in my 20s, I had the capacity to see the big picture like I have the capacity to see it now. And that's just life. It's one of the reasons why I'm so convinced it's so good to be in a church that is multi-generational, because we're not all one age. We have the ability to tie into the wisdom of some who've been around a while, and we have the ability to look and to learn from the youth who have all the energy and all the new ideas. And if we can learn somehow to get together with each other, we can do some great things, because we really do need one another. I think we lose the big picture when we lose confidence, when we somehow something zaps us so big that we get gun shy. We don't know what to do, and we kind of lose sight that there's a bigger picture in all of this thing. And then I think sometimes we just get so emotionally dominated by an issue that we can't see past our nose, in a sense. You just can't see. We're so emotionally caught up in the whole thing that we can't see that there's a bigger picture out here that's going on. And it's one of the reasons why it's so important in a crisis to somehow be able to move beyond just the emotion. You can't move completely beyond the emotion, but to move beyond that and to get some advice, and we're going to talk about that in a moment too. So how do you kind of look at the big picture? These are some things I've learned down through the years. If I need to see the big picture, sometimes if I'm emotionally dominated by the whole thing, if I'm kind of at that point where I've kind of lost my lack of confidence in what I'm doing and I'm not sure even to take the next step, what I've found I need to do is I need to bring around me some people that are good at problem solving. When we were in Hope Again, towards the end of our time there, we just hit some walls that I had no idea what to do with. And by that time, we'd been at this a number of years. We were tired. We were running low on energy. We were emotionally spent as well as emotionally kind of dominated by the whole thing. And I realized I was at a point where I had no idea what to do. I was at that point a lot down there, but at that point, I had no idea what to do. And I remember sitting in my office one day thinking, what I need here is I need some people that can help me think this thing through. And so I kind of went through my memory banks and through my contact list, and I found all of the people that I could remember in my past and in my present that were good problem solvers, and that they knew homelessness, they knew our ministry, they knew me, they knew our situation a little bit, and I just one by one started calling them and saying, here, would you be willing to come and help? We're going to set aside a Saturday, and would you be willing to come? And I need to explain what's going on. I need to get your advice. And I think I invited about 15 people that I could think of to sit around a table, and I just kind of poured out my heart and said, now, what are my options? What can we do? Help me get back to the big picture of what's going on here. And it was incredible. I said, I'm not asking you to be on the board. I'm not even asking you to give. I'm not asking you for any of those things. I just need your advice. And it was amazing. But what I find is that there are a lot of people, and when I was younger, I was probably one of them, who just thought, eventually I'll figure this out on my own. I don't need to ask anybody. And we need one another, and especially those gifted in the area of problem solving. Because there are people who are just kind of gifted at that, who are able to see that. They're going to ask questions like, what's the problem? What's the background? One of my favorites is, okay, so if you take this course of action, what's the worst thing that can happen? And sometimes, amazingly, you think that through and you think, well, I guess we could take that risk. What's the worst that can happen here? What are the options? What's the best way to proceed? Has anything like this ever worked before? What have we learned? How are you going to keep this from happening again? All of those kinds of things are questions that get us thinking about the bigger picture of the whole thing. One of the things that we just need to remember is that we don't have to be in a crisis alone. In fact, it's really best not to be in the crisis alone. It's best to have somebody there with you and to learn with you. So we need to get a picture of what is the big picture. What's really going on? What's God seeking to do here? And even in our current situation here at Emmanuel, one of the things we need to step back and look at sometimes is, what's God really trying to do here? What's this all about? What's really going on here? What does God really want us to learn in this whole process? And then the next thing in the process is you need to, in the midst of crisis, I think it's one of the hardest things, but we need to keep doing what is right. It's easy in the midst of a crisis to excuse our behavior and excuse what we're doing and just say, well, I'm in the middle of this right now. I can't think straight, and I know I'm not acting like a Christian. I'm not thinking like, but tough. This is just who I am and who I am. Well, that works for a day or so. That works for a short season. But this gets back to gets back to our character. Who are we on the inside? Do we have the ability to keep doing what is right even in the midst of crisis? So one of the things, even with all that's going on at Emmanuel, what are we doing? We're still gathering together to worship every Sunday. We're still taking an offering. We're having Christmas concerts. We're continuing to do not just business as usual, but we're continuing to do the right things because they're the right things to do. And we continue to do that. That speaks of the character of who we are. So if I'm in the midst of a crisis, I'm having maybe a major health issue, do I still continue to reach out? Do I go to church? Do I read my Bible? Do I pray? Do I continue to do those things which I know to be the right things to do as much as I can physically, because sometimes there are physical limitations? Can you maintain your ability to continue to do that even when I don't know what the outcome is? It's not easy. I'm not pretending that it's easy, but can you maintain that ability to do that? Or can you control the anger? Can you bring some of these other things that are not productive in solving a problem? Can we keep those under control enough to be able to solve the issues? Do the right things. The Bible has no issue with us being angry. Anger is not an unbiblical thing, but anger unbridled is. In James it says, the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. There is a point at which anger unbridled becomes ungodly. Can we do the right thing and keep that anger bridled? Can we keep it in control? Can we keep the emotions somewhat under control? Doesn't mean we don't get emotional, as much as Scandinavians can. It doesn't mean we can't. It just means there's some. Is there a rightness in all of that, in doing what is right, even when things are going badly, and keep doing what is right? You've maybe heard that saying, when you cannot, speaking of God, when you cannot trace his hand, trust his heart. Never doubt in the dark what you know to be true in the light, what has been revealed in the light. Those are important kinds of things. We don't throw away all that we've learned in all of our Christianity just because we're going through a crisis. We keep doing the right things. And then a couple more things, and then we'll be done. We need to learn from the crisis. Are we learning? Are we learning from it at all? John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under Dwight Eisenhower years ago, said, "The measure of success is not whether you have a tough problem to deal with, but whether it's the same problem you had last year." Have we learned anything? Are we growing? Are we doing anything about it? Have we learned? And I have found one of the things I look for in leaders, when I'm looking for leaders in a church, is I'm looking for someone who is a lifelong learner. I still love to learn. I love to read. I don't seem to ever get quite enough time to read. It's probably my own discipline, but I love to read. I love to read biographies and some books on theology, and I love to read history books and novels. I just love to read because I love to learn. And I think as I've gotten older, most of you know that I love to talk and I love to tell stories, and that's just kind of who I am. But I have learned in the last several years that I'm finding it very enjoyable to sit back and not talk, but listen. And ask a few questions and listen to see what other people are saying. And it's actually, I kind of wish I'd learned that a long time ago, but because I want to keep learning. So when we drive across the country, we stop at different places. I want to learn about these. I want to keep learning. I don't want to get to the place where I go, well, I'm mostly retired now, so does this come out is this going to come out in a movie form? Can I just watch a movie or buy the Cliff Notes, or do I have to go through the whole thing? And every now and then someone will give me a new author and I'll read. Someone gave me about a year ago an author on management, and I found one of his books and realized I already had one of his books and apparently had read it. But I loved it. So within the next several months, I'd read all 8 of his books. Then I kind of do that. I'm kind of a binge reader. But I love to learn. Do you love to learn? Do you like to learn from what's going on in life and what's happening in your life? Or are you one of those that kind of feels, I've learned all I need to, got what I need, I'm good. I'm retired now, forget it. It's going to be a frustrating life probably for you. The final thing, and this one I threw in just because I think it's important, but it's also kind of fun. And that one is just don't take yourself too seriously. It's okay to laugh at yourself every now and then. Other people are probably laughing at you anyway, so you might as well join them and laugh and have a good time. I come from a family who seriously believes that you need a good belly laugh every day just for your health. And if you don't think that works, I've got a 98-year-old mother who laughs every day, usually at herself, because she does some really crazy things at that age. But I take I'll tell people, I take what I do very seriously. I take the responsibility of being an interim pastor very seriously. I want to make sure that you get your money's worth. I want to make sure that I'm doing the right things the right way. And I take what I do really quite seriously. But honestly, I take myself not too seriously. There are clearly other people that could do this, probably better qualified, that could do it. If I disappeared from the scene tomorrow, in a few months it'd be, who's that guy again? We're all dispensable. The whole life of the church doesn't depend on me, on one person or 2 people. This is much bigger than you. And so relax. Lighten up. Enjoy a good laugh now and then. You could have laughed a little bit better at my story at the beginning. It would have been okay. But, don't take yourself so seriously. Have some fun in the process. And even in the crisis, kick back and have some fun. Enjoy some other things. Take a break. Take a diversion and do something different. I remember years ago a gal that was fighting cancer, and she was, and those of you that have been down that road and have had serious cases of cancer that have come through it and have fought that, you know how that just consumes every moment of your life practically, because there's so much therapy and this and that. It consumes you. And I remember one day running into her, not literally, but talking to her and asking how she was doing. And she said, last Saturday, she said, was just the coolest day. She said, it was my nephew's birthday. He was about 4 years old, and we went to his birthday party. And for about 4 hours, none of us ever thought about my cancer. We just kicked back and had a good time, and it was so much fun. And now I got to think about the cancer again. But I had that break, and it was so nice. So, learn to not take yourself so seriously and kind of enjoy the journey that you're on as well. Let me close with this. You've got all of those things. Maintain the right attitude and all of the. Can we go back to that one last slide again? Maintain a proper perspective. Take responsibility. Don't lose sight of the big picture. Do what's right. Learn from the crisis. Don't take yourself so seriously. I think if you were to look at Joseph, I think most of those fit him. I think if you were to look at many of the biblical characters, most of those fit the characters that have come through those crises and have done fairly well. I know that this wasn't a message that was verse by verse, but I think it speaks to the tone of what's in Scripture and the tone of how we're to do that. So let me end with this, and then I will close. Each new morning, before you awaken, life makes a delivery to your front door, rings the doorbell, and runs. Each package is cleverly wrapped. Put together, they comprise a series of challenging opportunities brilliantly disguised as unsolvable problems. They are wrapped in paper with big print that says, "Watch out, better worry about this one. Danger, this will bring fear. Impossible, you'll never be able to handle this one." When you hear the doorbell ring in the morning, try something new. Let Jesus Christ answer the door. Let him take the crisis. Father in heaven, thank you for your word and for the tone of your word. And Father, I just pray for each one of us this morning. We all, at various levels, can identify with what we've been talking about this morning. Some of us are going through really, really difficult things right now, and it certainly was not my intent to make light of those. Some are going through other kinds of trials, and you know what they are, and you know who they are, and you know how they're facing them, and where in the midst of that they're struggling. And so, Father, I would simply ask that this morning you would just take that burden and just put it on your shoulders for a while. Carry it for them. Let them learn, let them grow, let them learn what they need to from this whole thing. But Father, just let them know of your presence in the process of what they're going through. And help them, Father, through your Spirit, help them to turn to you. If they need to, Father, help them to turn to others as well, to get the advice, to get the counsel, to know that they're not alone. Many of these things that people go through, others have gone through before. And so, Father, I pray that you would just help each one in wherever we are at in that journey. And as a church, Father, we pray that you would be with us as we continue to work through some of the things that we know we need to work through. Just watch over us and guide us as we do that. Help us to do it in a way that honors and glorifies you. And then, Father, we thank you for your word that does guide us and does direct us, and that we can learn from and we can grow from. Would you keep us deeply centered in your word as we go through this Christmas season and beyond? And we will thank you for that. We'll praise you for it in Jesus' name. Amen. I want to thank you for coming this morning. I'm going to ask you to stand, and as you do, I just want to remind you that if you are new here, we have a gift for you. There's a welcome table in the back. We would love to talk with you for a few moments and chat with you and give you a little gift. Hopefully you've had a good morning here as we've done that. And then let me close with this benediction for us this morning. And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. And may the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace now and forevermore. Amen. Thanks again for coming, folks. Have a great day. See you back here at 3 or 6 or tomorrow at 7.